Welcome to Roose's Book Club, everyone. This is Ryan Robinson, Parent-Chief. I'm the founder and director of Future Leaders Bermuda, the organization behind Roose's Book Club.
My name is Simrit Smith, and I am one of the founders of Roose's Book Club. And we want to welcome you back to the show for our third episode of this season, Perception and Reality. So, Rai, how do you think it's been going so far?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent the last two episodes under the theme for this season, Perception and Reality. And the first episode was about subconscious limitations. We were unpacking Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks. We also did that in our second episode, which was part 2, Subconscious Limitations, also known as The Death Spiral, where we talked a little bit about Frantz Fanon's insights on us as a people, how we interact in society based on our own subconscious beliefs about ourselves and each other. The gist of the conversation was that Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist analyzing the condition of black people living under colonial rule, essentially came to various conclusions which resulted in the idea or the concept that we as a people and our inferiority complex causes us to impose certain limitations on ourselves as black people and on others. The end result of this mistrust, these misperceptions, these negative beliefs about ourselves and each other is self-sabotage. Us sabotaging our communities, our organizations, our institutions based on negative concepts and ideas about each other. And that was the crux of the last two episodes, Subconscious Limitations. We're happy today to bring you to episode 3 in this season being all about challenging our perception and reality. And today's episode talking about how we must destroy in order to rebuild. Sam, what book are we transitioning to as we come off of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks? And what is in store for our audience today?
So our new book is entitled Black Power, The Politics of Liberation. It's by Kwame, Ture, and Charles V. Hamilton, who are both political activists during the civil rights movement of the 60s, and in kind of like transitioning and concluding one book to another. You know, Rai, we talked about the brain. We explored how the psychological impacts of colonialism shape us, like what we think about ourselves, what we think about each other. But more importantly, and the point of this entire show is always to bring it back to how it impacts community building, how it impacts nation building, right? So all of this is under the context of how does that undermine, influence, build us as a collective. And, you know, with Frantz Fanon's book, we were able to go kind of like into the individual and our personal decisions. But now we're going to zoom back out towards the collective effort. And for the next, 3 episodes? For the remainder of the season at least, we're going to start learning about the framework that's needed to move towards that collective effort. Now that we do understand some of those individual and personal barriers that we were able to unpack for Black Skin, White Mask.
So for those of you tuning in for the very first time, you are listening to Roose's Book Club. Roose's Book Club is a sub-project of Future Leaders Bermuda, and the aim is to facilitate critical thought and discussion around issues impacting our community and us as a people in the context of the legacies of colonialism, underdevelopment, historical inequity, racism, and injustice. Essentially, what we've done here at the team at Future Leaders and Roose's Book Club is we've spoken with our elders and compiled a curriculum of books that over the course of 2 years we read, and over the course of another 2 years unpacked, summarized, and turned into learning points. And so over the course of last year, 2024, you would have heard season 1, which was all about laying the foundations. How did we get here as a people? How did we get here as a book club? How did we get here as a society and the issues facing our community? We unpacked a few books in that season where we essentially laid the foundations for progress. We explored how we as a people got here in terms of the Black Bermudian community and Black people as a whole. in the context of slavery and colonialism. We looked at some of the weaknesses that were identified by the various authors, which contributed to our oppression. And we laid the foundation and outlined some of the crucial steps that are needed as preconditions for progress. And that's a term that Chancellor Williams used in his book, Destruction of Black Civilization, to outline some of the foundational steps that are needed before a society can even begin to think about building, nation building, community empowerment, and laying the basic foundations to then think, grow, and develop. And so where we are now in this next season, season 2, Perception and Reality, is really looking at the individual and looking at some of the barriers to progress based off of how we perceive things in contrast with the reality. And so we spent some time with Franz Fanon looking at the individual psychology and how our own internal limitations are imposed on each other and how that disrupts our progress within organizations. And as Simrit just outlined, in this next book that we're switching to, we're really going to shift now that we understand that Fanon's studies revealed that the psyche of Black people is so self-doubting and negative that it brings our worst fears to life. And now that we understand that our own insecurities and our lack of self-confidence and self-hatred cause us to self-sabotage and attack not only ourselves, but each other and those who are really trying to make progress, we're now shifting into this next book, which looks at how this affects our institutions, our organizations, our Black groups, cooperatives, unions, governments, political entities, sports clubs, how it affects us, the way we interact with each other, and what Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton outline are necessary steps for us to move forward now that we understand some of those limitations that we talked about.
Mm-hmm. So Black Power, the Politics of Liberation, is a work that was done in collaboration, like you said, with Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton, and it defines Black power, examines the roots of racism in the United States, and suggests ways to perform traditional political process to better serve the needs of the Black community. It emphasizes Black resilience, self-determination, and really puts forth the argument for true liberation, that it requires structural changes, which is where we came up with the title, The Destroy to Rebuild, because although somewhat militant in its presentation, at the core of everything that this book talks about is it's not even, I think, once we get to this part of the curriculum, we're past kind of like examining our societies, and now it really is about like this is where we start getting into the action piece a little bit, right? Where it's like, okay, we've done the examination, we've laid the groundwork, we've talked about all these things, barriers, history, where it started, and now it's like, okay, now that we've done all that work, we've laid all that ground foundational pieces, now it's like, okay, what do we actually need to sort of like start pointing out as this shouldn't be there, this needs to change, we need to start questioning things. And it gets a little specific in terms of now, like you said, laying down a framework, putting out sort of like a curriculum, putting out a guide in a lot of ways of what is needed for us as a people.
You're talking like you read the books.
I did read the book.
I mean, I'm just looking here at the preface of, we're talking about the book Black Power, The Politics of Liberation by Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton. And as Simrit just mentioned, I'm just reading from the preface here. It says, this book is about why, where, and in what manner Black people must get themselves together. It says this is not a handbook necessarily. It won't tell you how to proceed in day-to-day decision making, but it does provide a framework. We are calling here for broad experimentation in accordance with the concept of Black power, and we will suggest certain guidelines, certain specific examples, and we start with the assumption that in order to get the right answers, one must pose the right questions. In order to find effective solutions, one must formulate the problem correctly. One must start from the premises rooted in truth and reality rather than myth. We aim to define and encourage a new consciousness among our people, which will make it possible for us to proceed toward those answers and those solutions. And as the authors mentioned, this consciousness can be called a sense of peoplehood, pride rather than shame, and an attitude of communal responsibility among all Black people for one another.
And you want to know what my favorite quote is from this excerpt? It says, "This is our experience. Programs do not come out of the minds of one person or two people such as ourselves, but out of day-to-day work, out of interaction between organizers and the communities in which they work." And for me, that's really important as we get into today, because that is the premise for me, that as we start to talk about mobilization, as we start to talk about putting in frameworks in place, and even calling out organizations and the discourse that we see, it's not just to point fingers. It's not just to get on her and make noise. This is a real critical examination of what's going on in our communities, how it's affecting everybody, because it's not about who has power and who has influence. Like, this is real lives that we're talking about. This is about the betterment of Bermuda. And in this excerpt, it reminds me to put ego aside in a lot of ways. And it reminds us that the lived experience about everybody in our community actually matters, and it needs to be put on the table when we talk about how to progress forward. What is it that Bermuda needs, the programs that we want to see, the change and the progress we want to make? Everybody needs to be at this table. It requires the collective effort.
That's so real, Sam, because when we talk about what's happening in our community today, I think we're seeing that unraveling. We've talked about that even from Foundations in season 1 last year, that, for the last 20 years, maybe we've had our heads in the sand. Maybe people, who spoke out about the risks that we're now facing were seen as either conspiracy theorists or agitators or threats. But now I think we're all sitting in it. Whether you're in the corporate community, whether you're, blue collar, like no matter where you are in Bermuda society today, I think everybody is alarmed. Everybody is trying to figure out how we move forward. Everybody's looking for answers. And so for those of you just tuning in now, we're on season 2. If you go on our website, futureleaders.bm, and click on Roose's Book Club, or you go to www.roosesbookclub.bm, you can see some of the discussions we've been having leading up to this point, and you can see the books that we're using. Today we're going through Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, specifically the preface, chapters 2 and 3. But Simrat, I think what you just spoke to is the shift that we're now making in this journey, because today is a little taster of specific action items and points of reflection for our community. Prior to this, we talked a little bit about how we got here, and we talked about some of our self-limiting beliefs in our minds that are sort of mental shackles holding us back. But what you just spoke to, and why this book is so real, is because it's really bringing it home and talking about some of the particular steps that we as a people must take if we're really to get serious about solving some of these issues. So with that being said, let's maybe jump into it and start with some of the big highlights that we've drawn out from our reading, Simrit.
Yeah, and the first one is that liberation requires us to create our own systems and to control our own political parties. And what I want to encourage listeners to kind of put themselves, the space that I want our listeners to put themselves in, is that whenever we talk about politics, people can be turned off. But I want people to orientate themselves in a space where, as we talk about politics, we're talking about community. We're talking about not just PLP versus OBA. We're talking about any leadership role, any place that has power and influence. So that's, like you said earlier, right, that's unions, that's ministries, that's any place where government has any sort of influence, but it even stretches to Gombe troops. It stretches to churches. Right? Because these are all building blocks of our society, and they hold us together. And
they're all political organizations in the sense that they have leadership and representation, which have the ability to influence political outcomes. And I think that's a crucial point, because sometimes when we talk about our systems, our institutions, our leadership, we jump right into the Westminster politics, the PLP OBA. The purpose of Roose's book club is to really have a community conversation. And that doesn't just mean our elected leaders. It means any position, any community group, any organization where Black people and our people or Bermudians gather, make decisions, influence next generation, influence outcomes, and have impact. So that's a really good point, because we're talking about evaluating all of those things.
And what Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton outline is that liberation not only requires us to make our own systems, but then it requires that collective effort between the two. It requires the collective effort between the leadership and its wider community that it serves, right? So the starting point that he outlines in the book is that we have to develop a sense of community on our own terms. And this is a point we keep reiterating at every turn in every book. This is a central focus point of, this is a central step that every one of these authors who are, first of all, from different countries and are across different time zones, they keep reiterating this point. And to me, it stands out because if we really don't have this, then we are missing the fundamental starting point, the blocks, and it's hard to build on top of sort of like a soft surface, right?
So just to add some context for the point that you're making, right? In the preface to the book, there's a quote that says, "The definitions of ourselves, the rules we pursue, the goals we seek are our responsibility." And so what we're talking about there is how essentially liberation and empowerment requires us to have our own authentic systems and our own authentic autonomy and control, right? That ties into Frantz Fanon's book from the last two seasons, because in order to actually define ourselves, the roles we pursue and the goals that we seek, and take that responsibility, we have to have an understanding of ourselves, right? And how we show up in a particular space based on, like you said, Simrit, put an ego aside, having an awareness of our biases, our subconscious beliefs about ourselves and about each other. The other point that they draw out right in the beginning is essentially this requires, once we have that individual, let's say authenticity, it then requires effective cooperation between the leadership, our community, and those people. And I think one of the points you put down, Simrit, is that there is a disconnect between our Black leadership and then Black grassroots movement and the wider community. And the relevance of that obviously is, okay, we've covered in the last couple of episodes the need to individually look in the mirror and tackle our biases, our subconscious beliefs and limitations. Having done that now, when we show up in a community space or around a table of decision making, we now need to be able to be connected with each other and make sure that the decisions we make are reflective of that authentic individuality of all of us as a people. And so in Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton's book, they outline several strategic, we can call them steps or themes, that are essential to achieving Black, what they call political modernization and ultimately liberation. So they don't number these steps rigidly in the book. You'll see when you pick it up. But essentially, they have some things that they outline are necessary in order to develop us as a culture and us as a people, and really with a viewpoint of having what they call Black power, and they define that as the ability of Black people to control the political and economic institutions that affect their lives. So what we're talking about in this part of today's episode is really, what are some of those steps? What's the starting point? And then some of the steps that are required for us to develop that quote unquote Black power. In other words, that control over our political and economic institutions which impact our lives.
So if we'll just quickly read out the steps.
The starting point.
The starting point is, like I said, our sense of community. And then once we can have that and have that relationship between our leaders and our community, when we want to move into that mobilization, into these actual building blocks, into being able to put pen to paper, right? And then action those items, you first have to question your old values, your old institutions of society. And that just looks like being that just looks like having a simple conversation and questioning is what we have in place still working. Right? So
Well, I don't want us to breeze over that first point. I think we need to spend a little bit more time talking about developing a sense of community on our own terms, because we can't just jump right into the political modernization piece without really driving home that need for us to be on the same page and have that trust with each other, right?
Oh, for sure.
So I'm talking about like page 34 and 35.
And I know this is one that I feel on a personal level, because we asked this question in the last episode. Like, we asked the question, what does it look like to be Bermudian? Because when you quote and look at page 34 and 35, they outline it. Our basic need is to reclaim our history and our identity from what is like the cultural terrorism that we've suffered, from being stripped of being able to define ourselves, to even hold on to traditions and customs and the things that have shaped us, not even just where we are today, but like even to be able to claim ancestry, to claim and know where our traditions come from, because we know that it extends even just past years of slavery and oppression. Like, this goes back to when our ancestors were taken from Africa and the things that they brought over, right? So it's about being able to free ourselves from that terrorism. But I think for us in Bermuda, we really struggle to develop a sense of community, because to this day, we still aren't really free from that, right? When you look at our education system and the fact that every Bermudian will always make a comment about, oh, wow, I never learned this in school, or, oh, wow, I never really knew about this. And we've even gotten to the point where we do ask the questions of, like, why isn't this taught in school? And why don't we know this? And why weren't we taught this growing up? But we still have this like disconnect. There's still this barrier in place of the understanding that there is a disconnect, understanding that we aren't taught these things, and then first of all, where to get it, and then ensuring that the next generations don't have to ask those same questions. We're kind of still stuck in this place, and I think it's because we don't have the answer to. Not only do we not have the answer to what does it mean to be Bermudian, but I think that we've been fed so many different ideas over the years, is that we're still kind of fighting over what it means to be Bermudian, right?
And what you're speaking to, some of the examples that you just gave tie into the starting point for the conversation in relation to this book that we're talking about today. Because essentially, in the author's words, what they say is we will have to struggle for the right to create our own terms through which to define ourselves and our relationship to the society, and to have these terms recognized. And they refer to this as the first necessity of a free people and the first right that any oppressor would suspend. In a nutshell, what we're talking about here is, before we even talk about our systems, our organizations, how we make decisions, our leadership, before we talk about the ideas, the policies, the programs, we first need to develop a sense of community authentically on our own terms, because this is essentially our ability to come together and have that trust. So this part is the trust element. This ties into what Franz Fanon was talking about, because we can't have that trust as a community if we don't trust ourselves as individuals. And if we're doubting and limiting ourselves, if we can't put ego aside, or if we have mistrust or self-doubts and confidence issues, if we can't even speak authentically, right? So when we talk about the starting point for this book, it's we need to develop a sense of community on our own terms. And once we have that community based on trust, then we focus on what we're going into now, which is the next phase about our current systems. So we can't have the conversation yet around our political systems and whether we're going to go left or right, if we can't even get in a room together and show up with our full selves and have that discussion. And so the way that this ties in is if we're following the journey for the Roose's Book Club, then we got to first unpack ourselves and our individual traumas and limits and belief systems. And then we can come together around a gathering table, right? And if we have that trust with each other, now we can start to look around us and actually analyze the system. So let's talk about the next phase that Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton outline underneath once community trust is established.
And like I had started earlier, it's 3 steps. And he puts this under the framework of political modernization. So, Rai, explain what he means by that. Put that in some layman terms. We'll list off our 3 steps, and then we'll get into the details of it after the break.
Sure. So, yeah, one of the central contributions of the book is called Political Modernization. And essentially, this is outlined as 3 essential steps once we have that trust, which was the starting point. These 3 essential steps for liberation or empowerment. It's a process of political modernization which has to take place in order to essentially look at the world around us and rebuild our own systems. Because this book, like you said, Sim, it's not just theoretical. It's about how we actually get our power back. And the authors outline 3 major concepts. One is questioning old values and institutions of our society. Step 2 is searching for new and different forms of political structures to solve our political and economic problems. And 3 is broadening the base of political participation to include more people in the decision-making process. So when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about these 3 steps of political modernization. So just as a recap, we first need to build trust with each other as a community once we've understood our own internal self-limiting beliefs. And then we need to modernize politically. Politically meaning where we have power in our institutions, in our schools, in our community clubs, in our unions. We need to, 1, question our old values and institutions. 2, search for new and different forms of structures to solve our problems. And 3, we need to include more people in the process and broaden the participation. So today's episode, we must destroy to rebuild. I hope you're starting to put some of the pieces together, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get back from the break. Roose's Book Club is presented to you by Future Leaders Bermuda, registered charity number 1009. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of our organization or any of us in our professional capacities. However, the content of all discussions is rooted in carefully curated learning material, and in that sense, not everything expressed is merely an opinion, but a reflection of our research and the aims and objectives of our organization as a whole. In all our activities at Future Leaders, we encourage independent thought with a community-centered and social justice-minded approach that enables listeners to gain a better understanding of themselves, disrupt the status quo, and take charge over their futures. We ask you to listen with this in mind.
You are tuned in to Roose's Book Club, and we are on episode 3 of season 2, Perception and Reality. And you're listening to both myself, Simbritt Smith, and Ryan Robinson as we go over our new book, Black Power, The Politics of Liberation by Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton. And right before the break, right, we talked about the 3 steps that are needed that Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton outline, and that are needed to politically mobilize. And he pretty much lays foundations on the steps to take in order to really establish a strong foundation in the way we want to direct and set goals and set foundations in the institutions that we want to create for ourselves that are going to help sort of propel us towards liberation and freedom. Our episode today is called Destroy to Rebuild, and it was inspired by the song you guys just heard. It's entitled, it's Rebel by Lauryn Hill. The full title of this song is I Find It Hard to Say. And that line in the song at the end when she says we must destroy in order to rebuild is literally where we got the title from. But I hope you guys really took in some of the words and the lyrics of the song, because she really kind of creates this soulful cry for us to be able to not just kind of like take up arms and to not just rebel, but to choose to stand up and to choose us and to choose to really fight for ourselves. But I think it's also a little bit of a warning. And she says it in the words, as history repeats itself, so far you can taste it. I really enjoyed kind of sitting in what she had to say. And I enjoyed the way in which she even cultivated the song, because it wasn't in a way where we typically hear a political chant, right? It wasn't done with a whole lot of malice and anger and energy in her voice. It was literally like a cry. And I think it reflects where we are in Bermuda and sort of like the temperament of what's going on in the island. You mentioned earlier, Roy, that everyone is feeling this. It reminds me of the quote, "The revolution will not be televised. You're not going to be able to tap out." And we're all at a space right now where everyone's feeling it. Everyone's asking the questions. What do we do? What's next? How do we evoke change? And so as we go through the rest of this episode, I want our listeners to really sit in some of the things we're about to say, because it might get a little, it might get a little hard hitting at times, but I am encouraging the audience to sit in the spirit of Lauryn Hill's song, because this isn't about attack. It isn't about, like I said earlier, pointing fingers. This is a collective reflection that we want to take our audience through.
So tying that into the book and where we left off right before the break, Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton outlined what they call the 3 steps of political modernization, which is the process by which we as a people take ownership of our institutions and our organizations with a view to empowerment and liberation. And so we're going to run through the 3 steps. And we're also going to open the lines up to callers in a bit to engage with us as we navigate steps 1, 2, and 3. So the phone lines, don't call just yet, but get ready. 297-1075. And you can participate in our discussion as we go through each of the steps of political modernization. So why don't you take us to the first one in that spirit of destroy that Lauryn Hill was just singing about?
Step 1 is questioning old values and institutions. And it pretty much just means that we have to critically question, interrogate the existing political, economic, cultural structures that we have. And that not only just includes the type of government that we have. The Westminster system has come under scrutiny, especially within this last election. But I want people to take it a step further with our education system, with our culture and the way we view it and the way we try to monetize it, right? Like, it's more than just the easy low-hanging fruit targets of politics, but it's pretty much just like any organization that we have within our society today. We do have to ask the questions, is it working? Is it actually optimizing what's best for Bermudians? Is it serving us? Is it going to help us propel forward? Is it allowing for young people to be able to even come in and create change and to push us into the future? And to be honest, any person who is willing to be honest with themselves, we know that a lot of the systems that we have in Bermuda aren't working for us.
And I mean, Simrit, you mentioned some of the political organizations and structures, but I think it's also important that when we talk about questioning old values and institutions, it's not just the organizations, right? The authors referred to the political, the economic, and the cultural. So we're not just talking political party. We're not just talking about systems of government. We're also talking about financial. We're also talking about cultural. So when we talk about cultural structures, that is just the things we do every day. That's our traditions. It's our cultural representation. It's, you mentioned the Gombe's, you mentioned the sports clubs. It's everything that we do. Culture is just time plus some constants. So what are the things that we are doing as a people, as a society, whether that's culturally, whether that's within our organizations, that we need to interrogate? The purpose here is to break with the internalized belief that our progress depends on the current status quo and the dependency that we have been ingrained in today, and to examine, like you said, Sam, whether our current systems are working. A key line in this step is political modernization begins with the need to question the values and the institutions of the society. And so we would just invite the listening audience to consider, in what ways do we need to really challenge and question our old beliefs, our old values and systems, and our organizations and our institutions. We need to interrogate them, because some things may just need to be destroyed. That leads us into point 2, right? Defining new goals, institutions, and standards. And if we go back to what you were just mentioning in reference to Lauryn Hill, this is this step that talks about rebuilding, right? There are some things that we need to question and challenge. And the goal of step 2 is, rather than simply trying to fit into existing systems, we must define our own alternatives and build our own alternatives that reflect our own history, our own needs, and our own priorities.
And this goes back to, I think, a lot of what we said in The West and the Rest of Us, right? When we were talking about understanding that, first of all, these systems weren't built for us in mind anyway, that they were created in a lot of ways, even in opposition to the things that we needed, because the point was to keep not even just Black people subjugated in a space of oppression. But when you really look at society, and we'll include Bermuda, when you look at Bermuda and where it is today, a lot of times we're also just operating in systems of old period. Like nothing has been brought forth into the 21st century. Our laws, our schoolings, our buildings, like if we want to get really, really micro and really, really specific at every aspect of society.
Just our ways of doing things.
Exactly. So we haven't updated that, and it no longer serves anybody, right? We don't even have to put it in the context of a Black versus white thing. Even as you look at how we're trying to rectify the workforce and who we need to kind of like, not even just who needs to be in their spaces, but as we look forward into the future. I saw it today in the newspaper. When we look at the birth rate and everything, like how we're operating today is literally not going to be able to sustain us for the future. And so
we need to make new goals.
We do.
We need to make new institutions, and we need to make new standards.
And it's not going to be possible with the systems that we have in place. And that's a part of the destroy that's a part where we have to question the systems, and we have to make the steps towards kind of getting rid of or dismantling some of the things that we have in place, because they can't come with us into the future.
And we're going to come back to that point, right? But just, we'll put a tab in it here. But listeners, what we're talking about here is our Black political and leadership organizations. We're talking about cultural and educational institutions. We're talking about economic and financial institutions. And ultimately, the purpose of this second step is self-definition. It's about who leads. It's about how decisions are made. And it's about what values are prioritized. It has to be determined by us as a people, as a community, as a wider whole. That third step is achieving political and economic self-determination. So this step emphasizes controlling power and not just influencing it. It calls for the ability to elect and hold accountable Black leaders who don't serve the community's interests. It talks about having community control over be our educational, cultural, financial, or political institutions. It talks about mobilizing our collective power, whether economically or otherwise. But the key idea here is that power is not given, it has to be built. And so we've talked about these 3 steps of Charles Hamilton and Kwame Ture. Firstly, the starting point being we have to have trust among each other so that we can actually do things together. And then the actual 3 steps of modernizing being questioning the old values, defining new ones and new goals and new institutions and standards. And thirdly, achieving that political and economic self-determination. We're going to spend the rest of the episode discussing that as a whole and really examining our community organizations. And we'll open the lines up 297-1075 if you want to get in on the conversation. But why don't you talk a little bit, Sam, about some of your thoughts that you were sharing earlier about how some of our Bermuda organizations started versus where we are today?
So, as we look at the history, like the history of us being able to do this, right? Being able to do steps 1, 2, and 3, we definitely have a rich history for us here in Bermuda. And I think about the E.F. Gordons, the Camargue figures, right? So with E.F. Gordon, how he helped with building the BIU, how the teachers union came about, how the Black Berets started her. And it's pretty much, as you look at their stories and you look at how they were able to mobilize, how they were able to get things done, it's like this laid out all together, right? They were born out of community and they were born out of a collective. When you are able to really delve into Bermuda history and you see that it's together, right? Together, that they understood that there were issues in the community that they faced. Their leaders were chosen as a collective. Their leaders were chosen based off not just the fact that they had power or they were put into a position of power or influence, but it's because they actually had the necessary tools needed in order to be able to lead people, right?
No.
And so...
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you just made me think of something. And maybe this is where you were going, but that must have taken a lot of trust, you know? Like, if you think about how hard it is to run and build and like, think about how hard it is to build organizations today with the current challenges. And when you take that back in the 50s and 60s and the 40s with some of what they were facing back then, you know, like, I don't want to romanticize that era, but that's where we come to that starting point we were talking about, no?
And it's, like you said, it's not even about romanticizing, but I know that the teachers union, they formed it over the grave of their fallen comrades. Like, I cannot imagine what it must have been like to know that your suffering has literally led to your death, right? And for that motivation, that trust to come out of such extreme circumstances, right? To where it mobilizes you as a collective. So that's what really kind of resonates me when I look at the history of some of our organizations. It's collective because this wasn't just 1 or 2 teachers. In the example of the teachers union, that wasn't just 1 or 2 teachers that was having these issues and were suffering the consequences. This was a felt experience across the board, right? And that goes back to the quote that we had at the very beginning of the episode. Your community leaders work with the wider spread community in order to move forward in collective effort, because this is a felt experience across the board. And it says we have institutions and organizations, but we don't have trust and we don't have the unity and the belief in them. And what effect has that had on the breakdown of our community today? I really do love the term you've coined. Well, you haven't really coined it, but the term that you've used, right, is the societal decay, the community decay that we're experiencing. A lot of it has come from the fact that I think that our leaders, and this is a bold statement to make, but I stand by it. I think that our leaders today aren't really coming from a place of this is who we've chosen as a community. I think our leaders have come from a place of they just hold position and power.
And I think tying that in with the organizational aspect, what you just said is we have the institutions and organizations, but we don't have the trust or the unity or belief in them. So I'm going to spin that back to the authors in the book, because they're saying that without the community trust and that unity, you can't have the effective liberation, empowerment, authenticity. So I think that's why when we look at Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton, they said step one, or the starting point before you get to step one, is you have to have that community trust. Then you have to question the old, build new, and work towards power. We have organizations and Black institutions today that exist because at the time that they were created, the leadership held that trust. Now, I'm not saying it was perfect, but in order for us to have those institutions built and endure, you had to have that community trust first. And what we're seeing now is, what is the impact of our institutions if we have the institution, we have the Black organization, but we no longer have the trust in the leadership, or we don't have that first foundational piece? And what I think that ends up in is when you tie into season 1, where we talked about the politics of personality, because what we talked about was leaders who were in positions, they had the power, they had the authority, they had the apparatus of an organizational institution. So you have all the tools of power, but you don't have the trust as a leader. So unfortunately, it's like you got the weapons or you got the vehicle, but people are not in agreement with the direction. And so how does that impact? What is the impact now in terms of these institutions? Are they still having the same impact? If so, why? And if not, why not?
I think they're not having the impact because not only because of the breakdown in the trust, but I feel like when we stop doing step 1, which is questioning old values and institutions, it kind of puts us in a place of stagnance, right? So we're first of all kind of piggybacking off of the work and the foundation of our elders before us, right? Leaders come,
so we've come into an existing organization that the visionaries of yesterday had set up.
Exactly.
Okay.
The leaders that are coming into these positions are not coming into those positions necessarily because of Connect and through the election or literally through the people. They're not coming in through that connection of the wider community, right? It's just more of I'm now being in a position of power. It's a late election.
By default.
It's by default, right? And then on top of that, the questioning, the pushback, the accountability doesn't happen. So now we're left with institutions that a lot of times are kind of just there because they've always been there. And this is a critique that, again, it extends way past just even on the unions, because, that's what we started talking with the teachers union and E.F. Gordon with BIU. For me, that extends to sports clubs. When we look at the state of our sports clubs, the RAC just celebrated 80 years. And I wish I could ask some of our elders, our forefathers, what is it that they would have wanted to see 80 years later after forming our club? And what would they have to say about some of the issues that we're still facing? Some of the discourse that's still happening. I would wonder, it's the same thing for me with Gombe troops. It's the same thing for me with churches. And there's a quote here that is in the book. It says, no viable political movement, and we can change that to no valuable community organization could be sustained if it was so valuable to internal abuse by those in its own ranks. Exposing such imposters is not a matter of courage so much as it is recognition of one struggle that can be severely undermined by those who would take advantage of any opportunity to advance their own fortunes at the expense of the group. The same stance must be taken against those who use the cover of racism to excuse their own criminal behavior. And why I point that quote out, right? It's important for us to critique our leadership. It's important for us to question values. It's important for us to examine where we are right now, because I feel like we really are at a critical point in Bermuda. And it's so unfortunate that I've seen how leadership across the board has sabotaged those of us coming up and individuals who really are pushing for the change that needs to happen. Ooh. I've seen it. Yeah, like, let's go there. Like, I've seen it. I'm going to be really raw and honest. I've seen it in our sporting clubs. I've seen it at the sporting level with even organizations like the BOA, the Bermuda Olympic Association. I've seen it with my own brother in church spaces. I've seen it in my own profession, where we're working with community partners, governing ministries. And I've been told myself that I need to watch my place. I need to stay in my place. Like, that's literally been a statement that's said to me. I've had, these sly comments in meetings with community partners because of the way that I've stood up for some of the students in our organization. Unfortunately, I've seen it within like schools, teachers who are called out because they kind of are challenging, they're questioning, right? And it's not because they're trying to do it out of ego either. This is because they're advocating, and on their students' behalf, on other teachers' behalf, people that are getting into spaces where they want a better Bermuda, because of some of the leadership that we have in place, they are being criticized, they're being blackballed. We had Bermuda Youth Connect come in and do a session with our kids the other day, and yeah, they've talked about them being blackballed. And even you, Rai, I've the last couple of years as your friend have seen the sabotage you've taken, the criticism you've taken, and the way in which people have responded to you, not based on, again, a place of ego, but it's because it's people like you in places that are trying to really hold leadership accountable. And the response has been to sabotage, to exile, to push out. And we see that in Dr. Eva Hutchin, and she was able to tell her story in her book, that as an educator of umpteen years, she gets into political spaces and tries to make a difference, and then she is blackballed out of her profession. And we have to get to a point where, as a collective, we're calling these people out. We're calling out leaders, not just, the premier of PLP or the leader of OBA. You got to start calling out your presidents at your football clubs, leaders of Gombe troops, people that work at the Ministry of Education. Those of us who are in churches need to start calling out leaders. Like, at every level, that's how we achieve that political and economic self-determination, that controlling of power. That's how we do it each and every day as a layman person on our own terms.
So the wrap up for today is, in executing the steps by the authors of examining our current institutions, defining new goals and standards, and achieving political and economic self-determination, what we're seeing is these institutions that we already have, because our forefathers laid them, are no longer having the same impact, because the community that created those organizations has broken down, and the leadership no longer hold the weight that they once held. The key power drivers of those organizations no longer exist, and they no longer command respect. So group solidarity is necessary before a group can operate effectively from a position of strength in any society. And so as a community, we have to come to an understanding so that we can lead and run our own organizations truly. There's a quote in the book that says, only black people can convey the revolutionary idea, and it is a revolutionary idea, that we are able to do things ourselves. Only we can help create in the community a continuing consciousness that will provide the basis for strength. In the past, opposition has furthered white supremacy or oppression without even realizing it or even wanting to do so. We as a people must come together and do things for ourselves. We must achieve self-identity and self-determination in order to have our daily needs met. And in order to do that, we have to call out the false leaders and the sabotagers or saboteurs of those who contribute towards the mistrust and the breakdown in our community and our institutions.
Mm-hmm. And again, right, this is not just a critique to point fingers. This is really about being able to achieve the liberation that I think that we do deserve as a country and as a nation. And in order for us to be able to get to that point, because of, like I said, we're all feeling it. We're all in this together. In order for us to get to that point, there's a role that everyone plays. For our leaders, the accountability has to be there. And for us that are part of the wider community, the members, everyone who is in this day-to-day, we also have a responsibility in being able to call that out, but also being able to define ourselves for ourselves. This is all about doing things on our own terms. And this is all about doing things on our own terms in order to achieve that liberation and that freedom.
With that being said, this was a heavy episode for me. Mm-hmm. And I want to say thank you. Thank you for that recognition. And thank you for not being afraid to call it out. We said at the beginning of this episode that this is a bit of a shift from early in the curriculum where we were just asking how we got here and looking at the history. And in season 2, it's all about perception and reality, which means looking at our own false beliefs, and taking that accountability by matching them up or contrasting them with what the reality of the situation is. And we spent the last 2 episodes looking internally and looking in the mirror to see how are we showing up in our community spaces, and potentially sabotaging progress. But today, Sam, I think what you spoke a lot to is how we action that. Mm-hmm. It depends on our ability to question and interrogate. And then once we do that and decide whether we want to keep the old, it then comes into defining the new. Mm-hmm. And that is the path to achieving that self-determination that we need in order to survive as a people. Mm-hmm. So in our next episode, we're going to talk a little bit about Black visibility and representation, mm-hmm. and what we call the myth of coalition. Looking at the author's argument about how Black visibility is not the same thing as Black power. In other words, just because we see Black faces in high places, just because we see Black, quote unquote, Black organizations, mm-hmm. It doesn't translate necessarily to empowerment for our people. Mm-hmm. This is the real discussion that we have to have and the real unpacking that we have to do as we navigate towards those steps to having full agency. And so in a few weeks' time, when we come back, we hope that you will have taken the time to look at the politics of liberation. If you're tuning in for the first time, you have plenty of time to go on our YouTube page at Future Leaders Bermuda, search Roose's Book Club on YouTube, and you can catch up to date on our previous season and all our past episodes. But today was a heavy one, and we want to challenge those of you who are listening to engage with us online with your feedback at Roose's Book Club. That's on Instagram, on Facebook, or on our website at www.futureleaders.bm and clicking on Roose's Book Club. Any final thoughts from you, Sam?
No final thoughts. I think we said everything we need to say, especially me today. But we just want to encourage the audience to reflect and to take in not even just this episode, but the entire season. And we hope to see you back in the next 2 weeks.